Tonight, a tragedy in the skies above Washington and a search for answers. A collision between a passenger jet carrying 64 people and a military helicopter has left no survivors.
Crash, crash, crash. This is Alert 3. Crash, crash, crash. This is Alert 3.
While authorities work out how the disaster happened, President Trump is accused of playing politics with criticism of Joe Biden and diversity hiring.
Epilepsy, severe intellectual disability, psychiatric disability, and dwarfism all qualify for the position of a controller.
Among mass tributes for victims, Olympian Nancy Kerrigan joins those mourning the loss of 6 figure skaters, part of a club in Boston.
When you find out, you know some of the people on the plane is even a bigger blow.
Also tonight, the latest swap of hostages in Gaza for Palestinian prisoners. But there's anger in Israel after chaotic scenes surrounded those freed after almost 16 months in captivity. Plus, the UK considers cutting foreign aid to Rwanda amid criticism for its part in fueling violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's all coming up in the world with me, Gillian Joseph. Good evening. We start tonight with those unanswered questions surrounding a mid-air collision above the skies of America's capital city, Washington, D.C. There are no survivors following the shocking incident involving a Black Hawk military helicopter and a passenger jet carrying 64 people. After colliding, both aircraft plunged into a nearby river, prompting a huge search and rescue operation. Tonight, we're going to hear from an eyewitness and a former RAF helicopter pilot to try to better understand just how it happened. We'll also touch on what Donald Trump's had to say amid accusations he's trying to politicize America's worst aviation disaster in decades. Well, here's what we know so far. An American Airlines jet took off from Wichita in Kansas, carrying 64 people. It turned to approach Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport from the south. Minutes before landing, air traffic controllers asked it to land at a shorter runway, 33. But also in the airspace was a Black Hawk helicopter operating a training mission over central Washington. 3 were on board. At 8:47 p.m. local time, the 2 collided, crashing into the Potomac River below. Well, our US correspondent Mark Stone has our main report, which does contain footage of the moment the 2 aircraft collided mid-air.
In the skies over Washington, the moment of impact caught on camera. The horrifying collision between an American Airlines jet and a military helicopter over the nation's capital.
Crash, crash, crash. This is Alert 3. Crash, crash, crash. This is Alert 3.
Air traffic control radar captured the moment the paths of the 2 aircraft crossed. Hundreds of emergency personnel were called into action. Teams from DC, from Virginia and from Maryland converging on a freezing night on the banks of the Potomac. Divers spent the night in the frigid water of the river, scouring the area for survivors. It was at this stage a rescue, but given what the cameras had caught, a rescue based more on hope than expectation. And by the early hours of the morning, the news no officials ever want to share.
Despite all those efforts, we are now at a point where we are switching from a rescue operation to a recovery operation. At this point, we don't believe there are any survivors from this accident.
As the sun rose over the Potomac, the debris was visible, with questions now turning to how the crash was able to happen in one of the most controlled parts of American airspace. Well, the rescue turned recovery continues out there beyond the runway on the banks of the Potomac. It is a very, very challenging operation. The rescue teams are operating in freezing waters. The airport itself has now reopened, but the investigation is still in its very early stages. This is, of course, a huge first challenge for the new Trump administration. And from the White House, the president spoke.
This was a dark and excruciating night in our nation's capital and in our nation's history, and a tragedy of terrible proportions. As one nation, we grieve for every precious soul that has been taken from us so suddenly.
But then, with his new defense secretary listening, he sought to apply his view.
We do not know what led to this crash, but we have some very strong opinions and ideas, and I think we'll probably state those opinions now.
Pointing first at the military crew.
The people in the helicopter should have seen where they were going. I can't imagine people with 20/20 vision not seeing, what's happening up there.
And then at the air traffic controllers, claiming this national tragedy is the consequence of a woke recruitment policy.
The FAA is actively recruiting workers who suffer severe intellectual disabilities, psychiatric problems, and other mental and physical conditions under a diversity and inclusion hiring initiative spelled out on the agency's website. Can you imagine?
You're trying to figure out how you can come to the conclusion right now that diversity had something to do with this crash.
Because I have common sense, okay? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't.
The conjecture from the president will be in stark contrast to the methodical investigation that is already underway. Experts at the scene alongside the recovery teams, all as the search for those who died continues along a debris field that is widening with strong currents and winds. It is America's worst aviation accident in over 2 decades.
Well, our US correspondents are fully across this story. We have Martha Kellner and Mark Stone in Washington. Mark, you're near the scene at Reagan National Airport. What's the very latest on the investigation and what is now a recovery operation?
Well, to be honest, it is still in its very early stages. The organisation who is centred, who is at the heart of the operation, has made quite clear in a news conference this afternoon that their work will take time, that they will not be rushed, and they do not want people to draw any particular conclusions. And so the work continues out there, and we've seen it through the course of the day. Beyond the runway, which is now opened again and is very busy, there are still many rescue crews out there on the eastern bank of the Potomac River. Last night we saw them on both sides of the river as they tried to ascertain the best spot to be able to carry out what was then a rescue and is now tragically just a recovery operation. They're now focusing on the east side of the river. That is the easiest point at which they could reach the two wreckages of the two aircraft, of the helicopter and the passenger jet. They haven't yet recovered the black boxes from either of the aircraft. There was an earlier report that they had done so. They haven't, but they think that they're in shallow water and they don't think there'll be too much trouble in being able to get them. They also have had a massive download, they said, from the Air Traffic Control Authority. They have handed over a wealth of information very quickly, which they will be looking through as well. Our colleagues at NBC News have confirmed too that in the air traffic control tower at the time of the crash, there was a situation where just one air traffic controller was doing the job that would often be done by 2 people. One person normally would be dealing with helicopter traffic, a second person would be dealing with commercial air traffic, but sometimes one person does that job. That is within the safety rules of the FAA, but it is not the norm. So that may indeed form part of the investigation. But the NTSB, who are heading up this investigation, were quite clear earlier on that their focus at the moment is still a recovery operation to find those people who are still missing, still unaccounted for, and alongside that, the work will continue to find out how this tragedy happened.
OK, Mark, for a moment, thank you. To you now, Martha. What has President Trump had to say today? He's spoken at the White House in the last few minutes.
Yeah, this has been the first big test for the new president, Gillian, just 9 days after his inauguration, this huge unexpected crisis and a national disaster. It's at times like this that a president would usually use these incidents to unify a nation, to offer words of comfort and condolence, not just to the friends and families of the victims, but also to a nation in mourning. But as if we needed another reminder that Donald Trump is no ordinary president. He did begin his first press conference in the wake of this tragedy, striking what seemed to be an appropriately solemn note, asking for a moment of silence, declaring this an hour of anguish for a nation. But that didn't last long. Within moments, he pivoted to politics. First of all, blaming the Barack Obama and Joe Biden administrations for what he called declining standards in air traffic control, despite the fact that his first administration was sandwiched between those two administrations. He then took aim at DEI hires, that's diversity, equity and inclusion hires. It's been one of his main policy focuses since taking office just over a week ago. We don't yet know the circumstances of this tragedy. There are so many questions about what was happening on board the helicopter, on board the commercial airline, and in the air traffic control tower. So really baseless claims as it stands at the moment about DEI hires. And Donald Trump has just been signing yet more executive orders in the White House. He was asked once again about whether race and gender, in his opinion, played a role in this tragedy.
To be clear, are you saying race or gender played a role in this tragedy?
It may have. I don't know. Incompetence might have played a role. We'll let you know that. But we want the most competent people. We don't care what race they are. We want the most competent people, especially in those positions. And you're talking about extremely complex things. And if they don't have a great brain, a great power of the brain, they're not going to be very good at what they do, and bad things will happen.
President Trump had been earlier flanked at his press conference by his Vice President J.D. Vance and his new Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth. They both backed up his claims about DEI hires, so diversity, equity and inclusion hires, having a role in this tragedy. For instance, Pete Hegseth said the era of DEI is gone at the Defence Department and we need the best and the brightest. Questions, though, about whether President Trump should have been talking about DEI hires while bodies were still being pulled from the Potomac River, and especially as the race and gender of those involved on the plane, on the helicopter and in the air traffic control tower are still not publicly known.
Martha, thank you. Well, I'm joined now by Abedi Ismail, a local resident who witnessed the crash from his apartment, which sits by the Potomac River. Thank you very much for speaking to us. First of all, it must have been very distressing to see what you did. Can you share with us exactly what you witnessed?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It was somewhere around 8:50 p.m. I live at Buzzard Points, which has a strategic advantage point of view over the river and the Reagan airports in the military field where the crash of the plane happened. It was somewhere around 8:50 p.m. when I was getting ready to go to bed, and all of a sudden I hear a loud bang, bang, back to back. It was very loud. It was within seconds of each other. It was scary to hear. It was something you can only imagine listening to it in a movie scene, in a theater, but absolutely not in real life. It felt me like I was in a war zone. I tried to look up for the source, for any source of news. What is this sound? What is the source of the sound? Where is it coming from? And shortly after, 5-10 minutes, the news started to break out that there was sort of a plane crash south of the Reagan airports, where the path of the planes coming from south of DC and landing on the runway toward the north side. At first, I thought this is more be a military exercise, since we are very close to the Anacostia Bowling or JBAP military field, or I thought it might be a water plant explosion, but never in my wildest dream that I've ever thought this could be a plane crash, and not any kind of plane crash. We're talking about a helicopter, military helicopter, a Black Hawk colliding with commercial jets. And to give you a perspective, there are some source of news like what kind of missiles the helicopter was carrying to make such a loud noise. If I could show you the view right in front of me, the view is unbelievable right now. This is the Potomac River right in front of me right now, and a lot of activities right in front of me in terms of commercial vessels are trying to help the Coast Guards. They're trying to help the DC Park Police, the Arlington Police, for the recovery mission at this point. That's something to mention. One thing else to mention, I'm a certified U.S. Coast Guard captain, and I know this water very, very well. The currents of this water is very strong and streaming down the South Stream. So since the recovery mission has begun, it's been over 12, 13 hours. We're talking about possibly bodies are floating down south the river, plane fuselage going south the river, and we're expanding that search right now from 1 mile radius to 2 mile radius, and even more 3 to 4 miles radius. To that extent, the water stream is going far and fast. So far, they have found 28 bodies out of 60 bodies. So we're a count of 30 plus people to be found, whether they are in the bottom of the river or somewhere drifting along the shoreline. We have no idea yet. And to give you more...
Just to ask you, because we are running out of time, have you been contacted as a witness? Because your evidence and obviously the footage that you have will be very, very important to investigators.
The media outlets, nationwide, foreign, international, they have reached out to me just to make some comments about what I've seen. I'm more than happy to participate in any sort of investigation that could help the families, the victims of the families, to any sort of justification of what happened.
But investigators, official investigators, haven't been in touch as yet?
Not yet, not yet.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much, Abedi, for speaking to us. Thank you for sharing your footage with us as well. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Deadly collisions involving airliners are mercifully rare in the United States. It's been more than 15 years since the last major commercial crash. So what went so badly wrong that a military helicopter was able to crash into an American Airlines flight mid-air? Our data and forensics correspondent, Tom Cheshire, has been examining what we know so far.
The investigation will determine what caused this collision. But here's what we know about what happened from publicly available data. We've plotted the latitude and longitude and the altitude data from the passenger jet and the helicopter to show the routes that both aircraft took. You can see them here in green and blue for the passenger jet and red for the helicopter. Now, by 8:34 p.m, the jet had completed its descent to 4,000 feet and was circling back to approach Washington, D.C. from the south. As it completes that circle, it starts its final descent and began following the path of the Potomac River north to the airport. And the majority of planes arriving into Reagan Airport on that day did so on this runway on the left, but the plane was given permission to approach runway 33, the diagonal line here. Now, this airspace is often busy with helicopters, including the US military Black Hawk, which was on a training exercise. And this map shows the routes helicopters are supposed to take over the Baltimore-Washington area. In some places, helicopters are told to fly no higher than 200 feet, but in others, they can go up to 1,500. And it appears the Black Hawk helicopter took a standard flight path down towards Haines Point and past the airport. Now, the helicopter that is up here in red, it was flying lower and heading south. And air traffic control was aware how close the two aircraft were, asked the helicopter whether they could see the plane, a model of jet called CRJ.
Pass 25, get the CRJ in flight. Pass 25, pass line is CRJ. Did you see that?
But again, this is busy airspace. There is a larger jet preparing to land behind the American Airlines plane, a potential distraction on the runway that is more commonly used. And at 400 feet of altitude, 140 miles per hour, the flight tracking stops, the moment of collision. CCTV footage shows a flash of light in the sky at 8:47 p.m. local time. Immediately, air traffic control asked other planes for assistance.
Flight check 3, do you have any kind of like searchlight or maybe anything on board that would help shed some light at the east end of the field? It's over the top, head towards Anacostia, and I'll call you back. Muscle 1-3, do you have any kind of searchlight on board?
Around 10 minutes later, boats are already on the water. This shows marine traffic in the area at the time. Scouring the dark waters of the Potomac, they quickly located the plane wreckage. And at this stage, it was still a search and rescue mission. A few hours later, it became a recovery operations, as officials said there were no survivors. And questions will focus on the helicopter in particular, whether it was in the right place, at the right altitude, and if not, why not? But disasters like this rarely have one simple cause.
Well, I'm joined now by former RAF combat helicopter pilot and squadron leader Sarah Furness. Thank you very much for coming in. I wonder if you can share some insight with us, first of all, and describe what it's like to fly a military helicopter at night.
Yeah, sure. So night flying is an advanced skill. It's obviously harder to fly at night than it is at day because, it's harder to see. And in a helicopter, you've got the added factor that you're generally low level, so you're close to the ground. So when you fly a helicopter at night, you fly with night vision goggles, which means you can see the terrain. And if you're flying over a built-up area, which has got lots of lights, that might mean that the goggles will sort of sometimes struggle a little bit. So you have to do this thing called flip-flopping, which means you're partially looking through goggles and partially looking under the goggles so that you can see the runway lights and lights of aircraft. So it's definitely quite a specialist skill that we have to train for.
And so it would be routine for a Black Hawk to fly at night?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Black Hawks are military aircraft and night flying is very much the bread and butter of what they would be doing. So that would be something they would train for and regularly train for so that they are current and competent.
And completely normal to be within the vicinity of commercial aircraft?
Yes, it is. Somewhere like Washington is not too dissimilar to somewhere like Heathrow, where you've got specific procedures that you follow when you're flying close to an international airport and also in a city. And they would fly heli lanes routes, which are very sort of mapped out standard routes.
So what is the exact procedure? Because we're trying to establish, and obviously the investigation will go further into depth, but what could have gone wrong?
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously, it's very natural to want to try and work out what's gone wrong, and you can't speculate until they've had all of the facts, and it's so important because misinformation at this stage can actually really damage the investigation, not to mention be very distressing for those who are involved. Something like a mid-air collision, because the safety standards are so high, there are likely to have been a number of complex factors that will be brought out by a very thorough investigation.
President Trump was suggesting that the helicopter could have altered its altitude fairly easily. How helpful, unhelpful is that type of comment?
Yeah, I'd be very, very wary of speculating. I mean, you really do need to know what the facts are before you comment on anything. And I couldn't comment on that. In the heli lanes, the altitude and the height you fly at is quite tightly regulated because you are flying close to an airfield, and they'll have not above altitude. So I don't know what we've seen what the report was, and I would wait for the investigation to reveal more about that.
But we do know that both aircraft would have been in constant contact with the control centre, with air traffic control.
Yeah, 100%. You can't go into Class A airspace without having a clearance, so they would have both been speaking to air traffic.
And civil aviation rules are the same worldwide. Everybody conforms to the same safety standards. Is that correct?
So, for example, we have EASA, which is the European rules, which will be different to what the American rules are, but everybody is governed by ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, and that's the kind of basic minimum standard that everybody conforms to. And also, in order to enter any kind of airspace, you need to have briefed up on the regulations for that airfield. So they would have been aware of the rules and regulations.
OK, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us, Sarah Furness. Thank you. You are watching The World with me, Gillian Joseph. Still to come, from figure skaters to US Army soldiers, we'll take a closer look at the 67 people caught in this mid-air collision.
I'm Dominic Waghorn, Sky's International Affairs Editor, covering a world that seems to be unravelling. War, unrest, revolutions.
It's not his country, it's ours.
They have succeeded for the first time in their country's history in removing a leader from power. No freedom! Sky News, the full story first. There was fighting here, but there's clearly now a lull, and they're using it to bring up more ammunition. This is a mass exodus in which Russia is hemorrhaging some of its brightest and its best. According to the local weather channel, there have been more than 2,500 lightning strikes and flash flooding, all on top of this week's lethal tornado. What stays with you most in this job is some of the people you meet. What is your worst fear about what the Russians want to do to the children?
They're just boosting demographics by stealing young people.
Would you like to take the opportunity, Mr. President, on Sky News to invite Barack Obama to come here? Mr. Trump, are you running for president? Can you confirm it?
We're going to take a look, a very serious look.
On that day, we saw your fighters killing women, killing children. Was that a mistake? Did you go too far? You couldn't control your fighters? The full force of the state is being used to crush any protest. Free wherever you get your news. It's half an hour now past the deadline that Hamas issued, and we've now seen a third barrage of rockets coming in. Another alarm. The mood here is jittery and nervous. We're seeing the world get more and more divided, and it's our job to try to make sense of it all.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Sky News, the full story first.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive. Let's return now to that mid-air collision in Washington, D.C. We now know that a number of professional figure skaters were amongst the 64 people on board the passenger plane involved, while the US Army says 3 soldiers were on the military helicopter. Our US correspondent James Matthews reports now on the victims of the tragedy.
They're flying again into Ronald Reagan Airport. Downriver, a routine calm has returned to the flight path over the Potomac. The calm belies the catastrophe that claimed 67 lives. Taking off the day after is to fly past the effort to recover wreckage and victims. We are learning who they were. Russian skaters Evgenia Shishkova and Vadim Nomov of Russia are among them. The married couple were world champions in the 1990s. They had been flying back from this event, US Skating Championships in Wichita, Kansas.
Would you please welcome to the ice, Gina Han?
Gina Han was among members of the skating club of Boston who died. Her mother, Jin, travelling with her, also perished. Spencer Lane had also been on board the flight, another of the Boston skaters who died alongside coaches and parents who travelled alongside them. Spencer's mother, Christine, was with him. She too was a victim. Former US skating champion Nancy Kerrigan was once a member of the Boston skating club involved.
The main lesson I think learned in skating is you get back up. Keep on trying, and even when it's hard, you get back up. Even when you're crying, hurt, pain, you get back up and move forward. It's not easy, but that's what we all have to do now together.
In Wichita, they held a vigil for those who'd flown from their city and whose journey ended in disaster. At the Washington airport overnight, relatives of those who died had come looking for news.
I'm just praying that somebody's pulling her out of the river right now as we speak. That's all I can pray for. I'm just praying to God. She texted me that they were landing in 20 minutes. Landing in 20 minutes, the rest of my text didn't get delivered. That's when I realized something might be up.
The recovery effort on the Potomac will take days. The pace of operations has slowed, in stark contrast to the frantic, fruitless search for survivors overnight. A team of divers has located what appears to be one of the two data recorders that was on board the plane, the so-called black boxes. The wreckage lies in full view on the river's surface here. It is a sight to haunt this city. They know what cost the lives of 67 souls. They want now to know why. James Matthews, Sky News in Washington.
You're watching The World with me, Gillian Joseph. Next up, as President Trump blames diversity targets for the plane crash, we'll hear from a former assistant to President Biden on racial justice and equity.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news. The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way. I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Welcome back. We're going to turn to some of the day's other news now, and there's immense anger in Israel tonight over the treatment of hostages during the latest exchange for Palestinian prisoners as part of the Gaza ceasefire deal. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu condemned what he called shocking images of hostages being bustled through crowds by fighters of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. In response, he temporarily paused the release of Palestinians before finally approving their transfer to the West Bank. Our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle reports.
The scenes in Gaza were of absolute chaos as 7 of the hostages were being released by Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad militant group. This was the moment Israeli civilian Arbel Yehud, 80-year-old Gadi Moses, and 5 Thai hostages were brought to a point in Khan Yunis. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was reportedly furious and temporarily paused the release of Palestinian prisoners in response. Hamas has now assured mediators that this won't happen again. Eventually, the 7 released hostages were driven away and are now back in Israel receiving care. Agam Berger was the first hostage to be released earlier in the morning. She was paraded on stage in northern Gaza before being handed over to the International Red Cross in calmer circumstances. Her parents watched the moment their daughter was finally freed. After being reunited at a military base near the Gaza border, they were flown to hospital outside Tel Aviv, where hundreds were waiting to welcome her home. Inside the hospital, she was reunited with the 3 other IDF surveillance soldiers who were released last weekend. All 4 had been captured from the same base on October the 7th.
This is a complex, emotional medical event for the captives returned to Israel, the families of all other hostages, captives, and for entire people of Israel here and abroad.
The hostages' release was watched by hundreds at Hostage Square in Tel Aviv as well, including Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's Middle East envoy.
It's showing what a wonderful, how joyous the people of Israel are.
After resolving the issues, 110 Palestinian prisoners were released from Israeli jails, blowing kisses and giving victory signs as they were driven to freedom. Some into the West Bank, but others sent back to Gaza or deported to Egypt. Among them, Zachariah Zubaidi, former head of a militant group in Jenin during the Second Intifada. More hostages and prisoners are due to be released this Saturday. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News, Tel Aviv.
Well, back to Washington now, and fewer than 24 hours have passed since the mid-air collision that brought both an American Airlines jet and a military helicopter crashing down into the Potomac River. Investigators are still trying to establish how this happened, but Donald Trump is already drawing conclusions. In a news conference, the US president hit out at his political rivals and linked diversity targets to the crash.
The FAA, which is overseen by Secretary Pete Buttigieg, a real winner. That guy's a real winner. Do you know how badly everything's run since he's run this Department of Transportation? He's a disaster. He was a disaster as a mayor. He ran his city into the ground, and he's a disaster now. He's just got a good line of bullshit. The FAA is actively recruiting workers who suffer severe intellectual disabilities, psychiatric problems, and other mental and physical conditions under a diversity and inclusion hiring initiative spelled out on the agency's website. Can you imagine? They include hearing, vision, missing extremities, partial paralysis, complete paralysis, epilepsy, severe intellectual disability, psychiatric disability, and dwarfism all qualify for the position of a controller, you could have slowed down the helicopter substantially. You could have stopped the helicopter. You could have gone up. You could have gone down. You could have gone straight up, straight down. You could have turned. You could have done a million different maneuvers. For some reason, it just kept going.
Well, joining me now is Chirag Bains, who served as a Deputy Assistant to President Biden for Racial Justice and Equity. Thank you very much for speaking to us. So you were charged with bringing in President Biden's executive order in terms of DEI initiatives. What exactly did you bring in? What did you do?
The focus of our work for President Biden was trying to stamp out discrimination throughout government and make sure that all government programs worked for all Americans. There was an element that had to do with the federal workforce, that is making sure that it was broadly representative of and open to all Americans. That was not about racial preferences or any other kind of preferences, as President Trump often characterizes it. That was really about looking for barriers to entry and making sure that we were recruiting broadly. The rest of the work was about making sure that government programs, benefits, funding streams were open to everyone, not just going to those who had connections or experience in getting government support.
What's your response to President Trump, blaming President Biden, his administration, and those before Democratic administrations for DEI being responsible for a lowering of standards?
Yeah, well, first let me just say this is an absolutely horrific incident. I live here in Washington, D.C. This incident happened 10 minutes from my house. My heart goes out to the families who've lost their loved ones. At a moment like this, I think it's wildly irresponsible for President Trump to blame DEI. It's a disgraceful claim. We don't know what happened yet. Bodies are literally still being pulled from the freezing water. They have no evidence of anyone unqualified being involved. And the president himself said that. He said, we don't know what happened, but I have some strong opinions. And then he went on the attack blaming diversity. During the Biden administration, I want to point out there were 0 fatalities based on commercial airplane crashes the entire 4 years of his presidency. We pushed down the number of close calls, which are near misses, near crashes that need to be avoided. There is a real problem with staffing at the FAA and throughout the federal government, but that was a priority for President Biden. And I would point out that in 2024, we had the highest level of hiring of air traffic controllers in the past 10 years. So I think this is really disturbing that the president is pointing to diversity without any evidence. And it seems to be just a hobby horse of his and a way to evade taking responsibility for what happened.
He does seem to be suggesting that those that have been employed are substandard and they simply aren't up to the job. In his news conference, he said that people need to be hired in terms of their skill set.
He did say that, and that's true. People should be hired according to their skill set, and that is what happens in the federal government. The diversity and equity and inclusion work was about making sure that every American knew the jobs were available and that they could apply for jobs that they're qualified for. It was never about hiring people into positions for which they are not qualified. And to be an air traffic controller, you have to pass some very tough exams. It's a rigorous process. I haven't seen any evidence that anyone unqualified was hired for the position, let alone that any unqualified person was involved in this incident. So I think there's a misunderstanding of what diversity, equity, and inclusion hiring and practices were. I think the key here should be on safety. And I want to just point out that we're seeing a real disregard for safety and for the federal workforce from President Trump at this point. He came in, he fired the FAA director, he disbanded the Aviation Safety Advisory Committee, he froze all hiring across the federal government, including of air traffic controllers. And he's firing career employees, reassigning people, trying to get people to voluntarily resign. He's essentially terrorizing the federal workforce. It's chaos, and that's disturbing, and it's going to have an impact on the ability of federal employees to do their jobs well.
Chirag Bains, thank you very much for speaking to us. Served as Deputy Assistant to President Biden for Racial Justice and Equity. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I'm joined now by Eric Soskin, former Inspector General of the US Department of Transportation. Thank you for speaking to us this evening. I wonder if you can start by telling us what the process would have been when you were in post. What's the procedure now following an accident of this magnitude?
Good evening, and thanks for having me. Let me just start by saying that my prayers and those of my family are with the families of all of those who were lost in yesterday's tragedy. And I know that those prayers and thoughts are being shared widely by those involved with the investigation. Now, the investigation will be spearheaded, as you are probably already aware, by the National Transportation Safety Board, which is the body assigned by Congress to carry out accident investigations like this one. They carry out about 2,000 aviation accidents a year. So even though it has been nearly 15 years since the U.S. suffered a fatal commercial aviation accident, investigators have lots of experience. And those efforts would have been tackled first and last night by a team of investigators that is ready to go at all times on call for an accident should one happen. In fact, it's called a GO team, headed up by a chief investigator who will lead the investigation and has expertise in one of a number of subject matter areas that will be important for the investigation. And NTSB is sort of like the UK's Air Accident Investigation Board. So it's really the best and right body to carry out the investigation.
And one would presume that it be paramount to keep all evidence intact, although there is now a recovery operation underway.
That's right. One of their first steps would have been to go to the scene and begin the process of securing physical evidence, even while what was first a rescue operation and then a recovery operation was underway. In prior aviation accidents, being able to reconstruct everything that happened is incredibly important. And the physical evidence, including sometimes the location in which it is found, turns out to be important. In some cases, the NTSB will reconstruct an aircraft in a hangar, literally finding all of the pieces, even if they are underwater. NTSB did this with TWA Flight 800, which crashed into Long Island Sound, exploded over Long Island Sound, and they were able to, in a hangar near Dulles Airport, just here outside Washington, reconstruct nearly the entire aircraft.
We're running out of time. I just wanted to quickly ask you whether you're confident that the most competent people are working in traffic control, air traffic control.
Well, FAA has had significant challenges in hiring over recent years. My former office, the DOT Office of Inspector General, has published a number of reports on that. In our top management challenges report to the department this past November, we highlighted air traffic controller hiring as one of the department's most significant issues. And in a pair of audit reports in 2023, we spotlighted the training challenges that occurred when the FAA had an unusually low number of hires in 2021 and then paused training repeatedly to try to keep trainees safe from the COVID-19 pandemic. That has left the FAA challenged to have enough controllers in place to do the job safely. They also have challenges with their assessment tool and measuring its effectiveness. They use a new hire assessment tool to tell whether they are hiring good people who will make good controllers down the road. And yet they haven't really been able to measure whether that tool is effective at screening the best for the job of controller, ultimately.
So are you saying that there might be a problem with air traffic control hires?
Whenever you have, one of the things we've tried to point out in our top management challenges report is that when you put many priorities into the hands of an agency, it becomes hard for them to balance those priorities. And FAA over the last 5 years has been dealing with many different priorities, including the idea that it would change its hiring to diversify its workforce. And when you put new challenges on an agency and you say anything other than our top priorities are going to be hiring for excellence and safety and promoting innovation and completing our systems upgrades, well, adding those additional priorities can compromise your ability to deal with any of them. The more things you try to do, the harder it is to do each one to the best of your ability.
That's a very serious suggestion that you're making.
I think it's inherent in every government and every agency when it sets its priorities to recognize that setting too many tasks before it can lead to diminished capabilities. Do we know that that's what is at fault, or do we know that that had a role in this accident? No, we don't. That's why we have set forth NTSB on the path to analyzing what took place here. And they will look at the capabilities of the pilots in the cockpit. They'll look at the capabilities of the air traffic controllers. They'll look at reconstructing the accident paths and the choices of which approach path to take. And then within 30 days, they will release a preliminary report that gives an indication of NTSB's assessment on what the causes were, with a final report to follow later.
And what will be the specific questions that should be asked of air traffic control, in your estimation?
I think the likely questions they will look at are what were the staffing plans in place? How is the airspace being managed? What were the paths that aircraft were being routed on? How are the choices of which approaches to use being made? And what were the tasks that were vying for the attention of controllers in those last few minutes. They'll also reconstruct the entire flights of the aircraft involved to see how those flights ultimately led to this tragic intersection.
Erasoskin, thank you very much for speaking to us, former Inspector General of the US Department of Transportation. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
The UK government says it's considering a review of all support for Rwanda over its backing for rebel troops occupying the Democratic Republic of Congo's largest city, Goma. A Foreign Office spokesperson said the UK condemns the occupation of Goma and other territories in eastern DRC by M23 and Rwandan Defence Forces as an unacceptable breach of DRC's sovereignty and the UN Charter, which poses a fundamental risk to regional stability. The UK is actively considering next steps alongside international partners, including the possibility of a review of all UK support to Rwanda. Well, since 1998, the UK has provided more than £1 billion of development assistance to Rwanda, which the Foreign Office says has helped to lift more than 2 million people out of extreme poverty. Our political correspondent Rob Powell joins me now to discuss this further. And Rob, what's the significance of the UK withdrawing that funding to Rwanda? It's a large sum. We're talking about £1 billion. That'll be the loss.
Yeah, and around 30 million a year, it's estimated, in terms of direct bilateral support going from the UK to Rwanda. And clearly money like that will have an impact, especially given the UK has previously trumpeted the impact it has had in terms of raising people out of poverty, as you laid out there. I think this is also significant, though, on a sort of diplomatic and global basis, in terms of the increasing toughness of the UK's reaction towards what is going on in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the increasing spikiness, if you like, of the broader diplomatic position the UK takes towards the administration in Rwanda. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, spoke to the Rwandan President Paul Kagame on Sunday and made clear that if an attack did take place on Goma, then there would be ramifications. This is the government essentially laying out what those ramifications are. David Lammy also set that out when he spoke to MPs in the Commons on Tuesday. This is what he said.
I said that an attack on Goma would provoke a strong response from the international community, and my sense, speaking to other nations, is that's what they can expect. Rwanda receives, Madam Deputy Speaker, over $1 billion of aid globally every year, including around 32 million of bilateral UK assistance. All of that is under threat when you attack your neighbours. And in this House, we're really clear. We cannot have countries challenging the territorial integrity of other countries.
I think the question of relations with Rwanda is also interesting because of that previous scheme the previous Tory government had with Rwanda, where they had planned to deport asylum seekers, people that arrived on small boats to the country. A lot of money went over there. There was a lot of warm words directed from Tory politicians towards Rwanda. You now do wonder, given developments since then, whether they would still maintain that Rwanda is a suitable partner for a project like that.
Rob, thank you. Well, that's all for tonight's programme. Thank you for watching. News at 10 is next with Mark Stone, anchor.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news. The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way. I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.